All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to Cultish, Entering the Kingdom of the Cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts. I am here once again with Super Sleuth Andrew, the Super Sleuth of the show. It's good to have you with us. And we are here with Tanner Johnsrud. And how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Good, man. Good. So we're excited to have you on, and you had reached out to us a couple of months ago, and I'm glad we finally got to connect. So let's just jump into it. A lot of people have messaged us and have wanted to talk about Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, and I'm excited. I feel like, Andrew, both of us are just going to be flies in the wall here because if I'm truly honest, both you and I don't really know a whole lot about Christian Science. We know it's one of the cults in the category. Walter Martin here put in his volume. This is the 6th volume, by the way, that just came out of Kingdom of the Cults. So he has a big section in there on Christian Science. But let's just jump into it. Just talk a little bit, Tanner, just about your background. How you said your family is 5th generation. Just tell us a little bit just about what it was like being in Christian Science and where it really all started for you.
Sure. So, like you said, my family was 5th generation Christian Scientist. I have a niece who's 6th generation. So Christian Science goes back in my family pretty much back to the days of the beginning. My grandmother's teacher was a Christian Science teacher, was taught by Mary Baker Eddy. And Christian Science is what I grew up with. I went to preschools, to a preschool, a middle school, and a boarding school and high school for Christian Scientists. And every summer, I went to summer camp for Christian Scientists. So that was the world that I lived and breathed. And Christian Science was all that I knew. For me, when I was in college, I had what's called Christian Science class instruction, which is a training preparation to become what's called a Christian Science practitioner, which is a healer in the Christian Science religion. And so the day I graduated from college, I began full-time as a Christian Science practitioner. And I did that for over 15 years, almost 10 of which I lived in Boston, which is where the world headquarters of Christian Science is. And did that for almost 15 years until the day that my wife and I both came to faith in Christ. So we'll get into that a little bit.
Yeah.
For me, growing up in Christian Science, we always heard the jokes. Okay, you don't believe in doctors. What would you do if? And somebody wrote in my yearbook like 3 pages of a long joking scenario. What would you do if this horrible thing happened to you? Would you still pray? And I was just absolutely convinced that Christian Science was true. That Christian Science was the real meaning of the Bible. And for so many of us who are in Christian Science, we don't really have exposure. I mean, you have friends who are not Christian Scientists, but you don't really have exposure to biblical Christianity. And the way that you just go through your life, you assume that this is what the Bible teaches, that this is what is true, and it's unimaginable that it could be wrong.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate point of reference. There's not really anything else in which to contrast it by. As in, for example, this volume here, I mean, Walter Martin goes over a lot of the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy. We'll jump into maybe to some of the theology and her worldviews, but then you contrast that with Scripture, and like one of the best ways for us to learn as Christians is to take a look at these different cults, these unbelieving worldviews, and contrast that with what the Bible says. But with you, when you're just, and we always talk about this, when you grow up in an infrastructure where you're only taught that one way is the only way, just with our series we did on Jehovah's Witnesses, and you're taught to believe the way the Watchtower says to believe, you just assume that without really second guessing anything.
Oh, sure, absolutely. You assume it, and it's what your parents have believed, and your grandparents and your great grandparents. It's unimaginable that there could be any other way.
Yeah.
Obviously, everybody else in the world doesn't believe the way you believe, but they're all wrong. So you mentioned talking about the Christian Science worldview, and I think kind of the best way to get a glimpse of Christian Science is to compare it with the Christian worldview. So I just wanted to kind of look at the Christian worldview in terms of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, and compare that with how Christian Science views these things. So in Christianity, there's a good Trinitarian God who's created everything in the world, and he calls it good. And this is described in Genesis 1 and 2. And this is the creation that we see and experience every day. This is the world that God has made. And the world as God initially made it in Genesis 1 and 2 dwell in perfect peace and joy in the presence of God. Now, in Christian Science, God did not make the material world. The material world isn't real. Only Genesis 1 is true, and Genesis 2 is a myth. And pretty much everything that speaks of God as Lord or speaks of Jehovah is not the true God. The true God is Elohim in Genesis 1.
Okay.
And Genesis 2 is a counterfeit God.
Whoa. So just real quickly, so it'd be different from Gnosticism in the sense that Gnosticism believes that there is the material, but the material is bad, and it's evil, and therefore they always interpreted who Christ was, and it was the whole idea of the incarnation of who Jesus was a stumbling block for people who are Gnostics, especially even in the first century, those who do not believe that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. But in this sense, what you're saying is that Christian Science then would believe that there's nothing material. So in a sense, like right now we're recording on a set. We're here, our flesh and bone bodies. We've got Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults book made out of paper. We've got all our microphones and all our setup here. So all this material that we are looking at, we'd say it's tangible. To them, that's all an illusion in our minds. Or what would be the Christian mind? How would you say like a Christian Science person view just the nature of reality in the material world? Is that all that's an illusion? It sounds almost like it's Buddhist in a sense.
There are a lot of similarities and a lot of similarities with Gnosticism, though Christian Science would deny both of those statements. Everything that you see is a counterfeit of a true spiritual idea that exists in the mind of God. You and me and the trees outside, these are all spiritual ideas in the divine mind, in the mind of God. And the material world is a counterfeit of that. If you remember hearing about Plato talking about the theory of the cave, that there's shadows on a wall in this cave cast by a light outside, and those shadows are kind of the dull representation of something which is real and true. And that is how Christian scientists tend to view view the world in very Platonic or Neoplatonic ways. in in Christian Science, God is referred to as Father, Mother. They see God as both Father and Mother, and they have what they refer to as 7 synonyms for God: life, truth, love, principle, mind, soul, spirit, which are which kind of sum up God. For most Christian scientists, they wouldn't think of God as person. Nobody would talk about a personal relationship with God. God is more the principle governing all of creation, and is the divine mind, and man is made perfect by this divine mind, and is still perfect. We just don't understand that. So in Christianity, Adam and Eve rejected God's good rule over them. They rebelled, and that sin has consequences for all of us. We've all sinned. We're all rebels against God's rule over us. We've all contributed to just the deep brokenness in this world.
Yeah.
And the consequences of our rebellion are physical and relational and spiritual death. But in Christian Science, they say Genesis 1 is true, Genesis 2 and 3 is a myth, and Adam is a myth. And the problem isn't Adam's sin per se, but it's the whole thought that he was made from the dust, that he was material.
Yeah.
And Adam was put into a deep sleep, which indicates what they would call a hypnotized state of thought. And all of the problems of sin and disease and death, which come as a result of this hypnotized state of thought. And people often call it the Adam dream. So the problem with Adam eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil wasn't that it disobeyed God's command and trying to be like a god, but it was trying to obtain knowledge from the material senses. So in Christianity, man's big problem is sin. But in Christian Science, the big problem is a mesmerized belief, a hypnotized belief in a material existence. We aren't material. We aren't fallen sinners. We're spiritual and perfect. And because we're spiritual and perfect, and all that really exists is divine mind and its ideas, then anything that Mary Baker Eddy didn't call good, chiefly sin, disease, death, matter, those can't be real. They aren't real. And so we are all in this world trying to deal with this unreal illusion, essentially.
Right. So Tanner, what it sounds like to me is there's like a highly developed philosophy, right? And it sounds like it differs extremely from the Bible. So you were saying earlier that when you were growing up, you knew it was true and like this was the right way, to believe and understand the Bible. But it sounds like there's almost 2 different standards, right? So where did this philosophy come from? Where did it develop? Because if we're taking Genesis 2 and 3 as a myth, and now we're adding all of these different things to the Bible, we see that it's in conflict. So how was it growing up in the Christian Scientist realm? Did you have another standard to read alongside the Bible so you could actually interpret it correctly?
Right. So you have the Bible and Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, by Mary Baker Eddy. And you read those together every day. And you read selections from the Bible and from Science and Health that are put together by an anonymous committee in Boston every week. And those selections are read in the Sunday services. And there's no preaching. It's just reading those selections that you've read all week. And from the Bible, you might get part of a verse, or disjointed parts of verses, and then those are paired together with passages from Science and Health, and you read those in conjunction, and you wouldn't read the Bible alone on its own terms. She called this book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures.
Gotcha.
It is the key to the Scriptures, which enables you to understand the Bible. And all the poor Christians out there, they don't have the key. But Christian Science alone furnishes the key in order to understand it.
Yeah, so it's all the secret knowledge that goes back. You have to have the Bible, or do you have the special knowledge plus this in order to, that's the lens in which you need to read through and understand and interpret the Bible, is through this lens that Mary Baker Eddy had. What I'm just kind of curious about too is that if we want to just jump into the origins of of where Christian Science started. So what I found fascinating is that she pretty much said I was looking at the beginning of Kingdom of the Cults. We're just kind of skimming through the section on Christian Science, and basically she was born in New Hampshire, but it was right around in the early 1800s. And it was right around the time, honestly, what I found fascinating too, of Joseph Smith Jr., right when Mormonism started. Yep. So just talk about Mary Baker Eddy, talk about how what it was like, just talk about her life, what people need to know about her.
Sure.
And what I'm curious about too is that what was the worldviews and influences that made her what she was, and what was the religious atmosphere of the 1800s? Because I know, for example, in the 1800s in New York with Joseph Smith, there is all this superstition going on. There's all this, especially there's all sorts of just interesting spirituality going on in the early 1800s. But just
doubting and all that stuff.
Oh yeah, so just talk. Right. Let's just jump into the world of Mary Baker Eddy, because we're all flies on the wall here. We want to learn about her. So you just go ahead and just give us the inside scoop of where it all started.
Sure. So she was born in 1821 in New Hampshire and grew up in a Calvinist household. And she grew up just as Mormonism began in kind of what they call the burned over district, where there had been a lot of revival and attempts at revival, but people had left the faith. So Mary Baker Eddy was operating in New England that had departed from its historical Protestant roots. So even though Christian Scientists understand her dad to be a staunch Calvinist, I have some questions about how Calvinistic he was, but from various reports, various interviews that were done with people who knew her as a child, from her earliest days, she was involved in the occult. That she was involved in that she was a practicing medium and moved in a lot of spiritualistic and occult circles. We definitely see that as time goes on for her. Just kind of a brief overview. During the first 20 years or so, she was there in New Hampshire. She got married to a man 15 years older than her. And they moved down to the Carolinas. He died, she said, of yellow fever. All the newspaper reports say something entirely different. Anyway, she comes back up to New England, and she ends up sometime later following a man by the name of Phineas Quimby. And Phineas Quimby was a mesmerist who was a mental healer. He believed that essentially through the power of suggestion, you could bring about healing in another person. And Mary Baker Eddy was enthralled by his teachings. And she studied under him and began to want to heal others the way he had taught her to heal. And so she would go around saying, Quimby made me promise to teach this to other people before I die. And so she was doing that in the early 1860s. According to the first edition of Science and Health and the third edition and her earlier writings, she discovered Christian Science in 1864 while she was with Quimby. In later years, the allegation, shall we say, came forward that Mary Baker Eddy had plagiarized Quimby. And from that point on, she revised the origin story of Christian Science. She revised it to saying that she was healed of a fall on the ice in February 1866. And every Christian Scientist has heard this story 1,000 times. She fell on the ice in 1866, and she opened her Bible 3 days later, saw a healing of Jesus, and was instantly healed. And this was a point of profound revelation. She later told people that she saw heaven. This was the moment of revelation, and she was instantly healed. Now, she did fall on the ice. That is for sure. 2 weeks later, she wrote to a student of Quimby's saying, "I'm in miserable pain. I need help," asking him to heal her. She wanted to bring a lawsuit against the city, saying that she had suffered irreparable damages as a result of falling on the ice. And for the first 17 years after her alleged discovery of Christian Science, she doesn't tie it back to the fall on the ice.
Right.
But in later years, this has become the myth of the origin story, just kind of, in the same way that Joseph Smith's first vision has evolved many times over the years.
There's about 10 different versions. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Yeah, and it also seems that all these different cult leaders, they're never without controversy. There's always stuff going on. You think about all the controversy. I mean, Walter Martin talks about Charles Taylor Russell, just with all that was going on with his time as well too.
Yeah.
But just go more into where did it go from here with Mary Baker Eddy?
Yeah, so she ended up in 1875 writing the first edition of Science and Health, where I mentioned that she said she discovered Christian Science in 1864. In that first edition of Science and Health, she also says that we're God, that we can become God. So, for instance, and she speaks several dozen times about our God being, and she also let's see here. I just grabbed this. Trying to find this particular quote, but she says to lay aside our God being as of little use in sickness seemed anomalous, but she also says, when we become spirit, capital S, which is the way she designates God, we shall be infinite and one. And she says we are truth, life, and love. Again, these are three terms for God that she uses, but she capitalizes them. We are truth, life, and love when we understand that. She says we are never spirit until we are God. She says these things dozens of times in the first edition. She says that we are spirit, and spirit is God is undeniably true. So this is where her head was in 1875 before the first edition of Science and Health. Again, through the 1860s, she was still channeling people, according to affidavits at the time. Christian Scientists would all deny this, but affidavits of people who knew her at the time would say that was kind of her experience, and she talked about writing Science and Health being a mystical experience for her as well. She couldn't write during darkness; she could only write during the day. A flood of thoughts would come to her, and she wouldn't even read them. She would just write down what was coming to her. So sort of this automatic writing.
So at this time too, she was kind of involved in like spiritism, almost like that stuff was going on. Like you're referencing automatic thoughts, or these are things that happen to people who are delving into the occult, and still people still do that.
Right. Is this
today.
And she's like channeled into a source. But go ahead.
Yeah. So her first advertisement for students appeared in the Banner of Light newspaper in 1868, which was the largest spiritualist newspaper or magazine in the country. And all of her early students were practicing spiritualists, including people whose house she almost burned down in a fit of anger. These were the people that she was traveling with. These are the people that she was connected with. Now, today, the Science and Health went through over 430 revisions, and the last edition of Science and Health, she changed the title of one of the chapters from Christian Science and Spiritualism to Christian Science versus Spiritualism. And Christian Scientists today would all say, no, she never had anything to do with spiritualism, etc. If she was connected to people who were spiritualists, it's because she was bringing them out of it, or it's because these are the people who were open-minded. The churches were too bigoted to receive her revelation.
Wow.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just fascinated by this, man. Keep on going.
So so she wrote first edition of Science and Health in 1875, and she said that she wouldn't take any patients. She would be focused on teaching other people how to heal, and yet there are this book, Mary Baker Eddy, Christian Healer, came out about 10 years ago. And this is all of the healings that are attributed to Mary Baker Eddy. I haven't gone through all of it yet. What
are like some of the biggest, when she talks about her healings? In fact, I'm trying to remember the first time I got exposed to Christian Science. I was talking about in one of our previous episodes, when I was a young child, I picked up a book, and it was this Bible story book, but Jesus was on a stake. And I was like, what on earth is this? Even as a kid, and I just felt like repulsed by it. And turns out it was a child's Bible story book by the Watchtower that was written. I remember going to when we were going to a hotel because I had tried to get into the Navy, which I ended up getting medically disqualified from. I didn't quite make the cut. But I was staying at this hotel the night before to kind of go through the MEPS, the Military Entrance Processing Station. And I had forgotten to bring my Bible. I was a new Christian, and I opened it up, and sure enough, there was a Science and Key with Health of the Scriptures, and I'm like, this just seems kind of wacky. But I remember at the very front, I remember seeing all these different health testimonies, right? What were the health claims that she was making, because now she had tapped into the source to be able to bring healing, which obviously it sounds, even before you even gave the details about her connections to the occult and tapping into the secret knowledge even at night and just writing down kind of like what comes to mind and stuff like that. What were the type of healings that she was claiming to do? And was there any actual any sort of like actual evidence of these healings taking place? Or is it just, hey, this happened, but there wasn't anything really to back it up?
Right. So I've been through a significant portion of this book, tracing all the historical citations for it. And 95% of the healings that are in the book are attributable only to Mary Baker Eddy. She's the only person who said that these occurred.
Wow.
Wow.
So she spoke of, and I can make all of the details available to you guys to share. Happy to provide documentation for all.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So she talked about healings like restoring broken limbs, somebody's eye grew back, a cancer which had completely eaten through to the jugular vein healed. These are all healings which would happen instantly. The dead being raised. These are the kinds of healings that she claimed for herself. And in the back of Science and Health, there's 100 pages of people who claim healings just by reading the book.
Wow.
And just to clarify kind of what you were saying before. So when you look at the 5% of the healings that we do have external documentation for, these are not healings that Mrs. Eddy claimed for herself, by and large. There are a couple, but the majority of them are people like a boy writing 30 years later saying, I saw her, I had a stomach ache, and shortly thereafter it got better.
Right.
But Mary Baker Eddy claimed that when she was a little girl, she heard voices and was lifted up off of her bed and saw heaven. She claimed, and this isn't something that would be officially recognized, but it's certainly shared in Christian Science lore, that she walked on the water.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the kinds of claims that she made and that have been made for her in the last 150 years.
Hey, Tanner. So in regards to healings, if we were to think in Christian Science terms, what exactly is happening? There's not even really a healing, right? It's more of just overcoming an illusion.
Right. What's happening is a revealing of your true innate spiritual nature as found in Genesis 1, where you're not material, you're spiritual. And in Christian Science, having this understanding of what they would say perfect God and perfect man, that's the basis for healing. When you understand that God is perfect and that you're perfect, you'll be healed. And so for over 15 years, this is what I was telling people. People would call me on the phone for help, and I would something from Science and Health or from the Bible through the lens of Christian Science, and understanding those quotes. That's the way to be healed in Christian Science. And so for over 15 years, that's what I did. And in that role, you're not allowed to have another job. So that was my only line of work for 15 years. And you would be paid by the patient. You're not paid by the church or anything like that. So for most of my adult life, including nearly 10 years in Boston, I lived on less than $10,000 a year, which doesn't get you very far in Boston.
So you were paid by the patient, and
yes.
Was it an upfront fee, or is it contingent upon them getting healed as far as like what they of like how?
I personally felt like the way most practitioners operate is that they will charge per day that you are praying for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So they might charge $30 a day, and if somebody calls over the span of 3 days, they'll send a bill at the end of the month for $90. I personally felt like I couldn't charge somebody unless they had experienced a full and complete healing. That was my approach to things.
Yeah.
And so imagine having grown up in Christian Science. I never had a biology class. I was always exempted from all biology classes and health classes. So imagine growing up in Christian Science. You don't know how the body works. For instance, a woman called me up and she complained of lumps in her armpits, and she was terrified that this was cancer. And so I was talking with her about, that cancer is no part of who you are, et cetera, et cetera. Lo and behold, those went away after a couple days. Neither of us knew at the time that was just swollen lymph nodes, which happens. But in her mind and in my mind, that was a healing of cancer. That was a healing of a tumor, or of a growth. So there's so many healings that are attested by Christian Scientists who don't realize that, the body just sometimes gets better on its own. And that's the vast majority of the healings that I saw in Christian Science.
Wow. What about, and I'm curious about this too, because we obviously just did a little bit of research here, but I know when you look up Christian Science online, there's a whole process in which there's people get recruited into these sort of organizations. There's the Christian Science reading rooms, and I've driven by a couple of them, and I guess it's a place where you can go in and kind of like read the materials and kind of get inundated with all the different ideas of Mary Baker Eddy's teachings and stuff like that. Explain to us what is the purpose of those reading rooms, and what is that? Is that where you did your practicing at?
No, that wouldn't be allowed. You're not allowed to do that through connection with the churches. You either rent an office somewhere or work from home. So a reading room. Mary Baker Eddy is operating in the latter half of the 19th century, and back in the day, books were expensive, and so the larger publishing houses would make reading rooms available where you could go and read a book and decide whether or not you wanted to pay the $3, which would be like, a significant portion of your monthly salary, to buy a book. And so Mary Baker Eddy, wanting Christian Science to be seen as the best of the best, as elite. This is what was happening in elite society. She established these reading rooms, and every Christian Science church has a reading room, has a place where you can go in and buy Mary Baker Eddy's writings, as well as magazines published by the church, or the Christian Science Monitor, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning newspaper.
Yeah.
Christian Scientists are very passive in their outreach, whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons will come knocking on their door. The Christian Scientists are waiting for you to come to them, seeking healing. There are exceptions to that. There are Christian Scientists who are more outgoing in sharing Christian Science, but those exceptions only confirm the rule. The Christian Scientists are basically waiting for the world to be receptive enough to the great spiritual truths that Mary Baker Eddy has given us. And when that day comes, the world will come knocking down the doors of reading rooms to come read her book.
Wow, this is just incredibly fascinating. So then, as far as there's different minds. This is one of what you call one of the mind science cults. And in the beginning of Walter Martin's book, he talks about that that Christian Science and what Mary Baker Eddy taught was almost sort of like the mother of all the different mind science cults. So there's a couple of terminologies that I've seen like thrown around with it, and I want to explain too like how they're all connected. So I mean, there's Unity School of Christianity I've heard mentioned as well too, and also they call like New Thought. I've got a good friend of mine who came out of New Thought and became a Christian. But explain how are those interconnected along with Christian Science as well?
So the Unity School of Christianity, so-called, was begun by Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was a student of Mary Baker Eddy and editor of one of the magazines for a while until Mary Baker Eddy threw her out. And then so she started her own movement. And all of these mind science groups, Unity, Divine Science, Religious Science, they're all kind of under the umbrella of New Thought, which all trace back their ideas to Phineas Quimby. And nobody would know anything about Phineas Quimby had it not been for Mary Baker Eddy. Mary Baker Eddy both popularized his ideas, and because of the plagiarism allegations against her, that caused his writings to be published independently. And Mary Baker Eddy is the mother of of all of these different schools of thought. And one of the but Christian Science would see a distinction between Christian Science and all of these other groups. It would say that they've all gone astray. It wouldn't claim connection with them.
Right.
And maybe we can get into some of the implications of that a little bit more. But one of the unique distinctives of Christian Science that you see is a focus on what's called animal magnetism, or mesmerism. And Quimby practiced mesmerism, which is just this idea that essentially through suggestion, you could bring about healing. And then the converse is true, that through suggestion, you could hurt somebody. And so Mary Baker Eddy was very convinced that those who left her movement were mentally trying to kill her through thinking negative thoughts about her. And this is referred to as malicious animal magnetism in Christian Science. And so Christian scientists are constantly trying to protect their thought, this is how they would term it, against anything that would change in their leader, against anything that would make them believe that they are material, or that sickness is real, or that they are sinful. And that's another core element of Christian Science. Not all of the mind science groups out there took that teaching with them, but they all share this belief that essentially you're spiritually understanding who you truly are is going to bring healing to you.
It's very similar to, Jim Jones, Father Jehovah, Father Divine. These proponents of New Thought essentially believed that literally they can grab from this spiritual dimension. I know Christian Science would deny this physical reality, but I'm speaking in regards to New Thought, that they could actually influence and change and manifest spiritual manifestations from a spiritual reality into this physical reality in order to make changes to this reality. So it sounds like what they got from Christian Science, as Christian Science would they almost agree that everything we see here is just a kind of like an agreed upon illusion, that literally, like Mary Baker Eddy is saying, these bad thoughts really literally can affect me, because these thoughts are what make this illusion a reality for us, in a sense. Like that's kind of what it sounds like to me. Does that make sense, Tanner?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And you actually pointed this out in a previous episode, that Jim Jones and Father Divine, they got ideas from Quimby.
Wow.
And again, nobody would know anything about Quimby if it weren't for Mary Baker Eddy. So they are all in this same stream. But there are actually a lot of groups that have gotten a real influence from Christian Science, even though they aren't Christian Science today. But there's a lot of influence for them. So, for instance, E.W. Kenyon was a well-known pastor who had a lot of influence on Kenneth Hagin, and Kenyon got his ideas from Quimby and the New Thought movement. So Kenneth Hagin is the father of the word faith theology, of the prosperity gospel, of this idea that God wants you to have wealth and health here and now, and that's what the message of the Bible is. Your best life now. Joel Osteen has also been heavily influenced by those teachings, as was his dad before him.
Right. I mean, go ahead.
And when you think about it, I mean, Christian Science's message is that the whole point is healing in this world. It's getting rid of the illusion of sickness. It's not about sin. It's not about a holy God. It's not about a hope for eternal life, as we understand it as Christians. But it's a very this world focus, and that's where Christian Science is, and we see that played out in these word faith teachers, these prosperity gospel teachers. If you just Google Google Christian Science and E.W. Kenyon, you can have a field day with that. Christian Science and Kenneth Hagin, Kenneth Copeland, Joel Osteen, etc. Another example of that influence was in New York. There was a very popular pastor, Norman Vincent Peale, got his ideas from New Thought. He spoke to people who confirmed that connection. He confirmed that connection with them. Norman Vincent Peale was also the pastor for a young man by the name of Donald Trump. Maybe you've heard of him.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, Donald Trump's worldview has been shaped by New Thought and Christian Science, and Donald Trump doesn't drink, as neither do Christian Scientists, at least not officially. I never thought of drinking.
Well, it's interesting too.
Anyway,
just go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's all right. We're on Skype, so it's not maybe there's a little bit of delay or whatever. But I just noticed too that I haven't followed a lot of the news, but sometimes you're leading up to election 2020 is around the corner. It just starts bleeding over. But I've always noticed that Trump, in his ability to try and the type of evangelicals he hangs around, are a lot of the typical like health and wealth and prosperity preachers. I think one of his main spiritual advisors is Paula White. And yeah, so you get that sort of influence, the typical evangelical, a lot of those like health and wealth and prosperity preachers seem to be right around that sphere of influence. And you even mentioned as well too, Joel Osteen. Because people had messaged us before, like, "Hey, are you guys gonna do a Cultish episode all in Joel Osteen?" And I was like, I don't really know about that. Like, that seems to be kind of more in the realm of like a discernment ministry kind of sort of thing, and I don't know if that's really covers the type of material we cover. But you mentioned too, there's a briefing that Albert Mohler did talking about the influences on Christian Science and Joel Osteen, and his big thing a lot of times, a lot of his sermons too, are the the power of words and the power of your thoughts, and you basically speak your reality like into existence. Where, in a sense, that's similar to. There's a level where it's similar to Christian Science, even though technically there is no material reality. He is saying you invisibly speak out what is material and visible eventually.
Right. So, exactly. He's getting that straight out of New Thought, straight out of Christian Science, and so a Christian scientist is going to be very careful with their words and be very careful about what things that they listen to. You mute every medicine commercial as a kid growing up because you don't want to accept sickness as real, because if you're accepting it as real, then you can get sick. And you just want to be very careful with with what you're saying, and more to the point what you're thinking, because your thought determines your experience.
Tanner, this is taking me back to what you said in the beginning, how Mary Baker Eddy in the beginning was talking about how we are God, essentially, right? So we know that God spoke everything into existence. It almost seems like the fear of words is because they equate themselves with God. So we can speak into existence because we have that image of God. And that's absolutely terrifying in a sense, and it makes sense as well that there's so many offshoots from Christian Science, because we have this person who obtains this secret knowledge that at first questions the word of God and says, no, there's something more, and you need this to interpret the Bible, and you need a guru to do that. So we have Mary Baker Eddy. This is actually the downfall of what they believe in, number one, because there's going to be other people who come along, other prophets, other gurus who have just a slightly different viewpoint, who is also obtaining this secret further knowledge, as in, New Thought. Then we go Father Jehovah with the beginning of divine economic socialism, into Jim Jones, which is essentially the same thing, but he's like, well, let's take this a step further. And it's extremely interesting, I find, that it can go so many different directions, because when you believe that you are God, that means now your words become the standard. Yep. So anyone literally can challenge you, and we don't have a standard anymore because everyone's beliefs end up on the same playing field. And we know that's not true according to Scripture.
Yes, and it feels like every single one of these cults and movements. Now, funny, I was thinking the whole time, like through Jones-colored glasses, and thinking about how all these different worldviews just sort of become like a genetic hybrid of just a bunch of different ideas and pools of thought. And it seems like as it progresses along, it just merges into something else. Like you mentioned, all the occultic and Mary Baker Eddy being a medium, and even just initially, like I said, listening to some of her teachings and things that she was saying, it's like, man, that just sounds so Eastern, and it's not surprising. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and wrap this up for now. This will be part one. We're going to jump into a lot more of your story, Tanner, just about the progression of it, and more about just your influences as a kid and also growing up with it, how you came out of it. So this will be part one of our initial episode on Christian Science. I feel like we've only just barely scratched the bare surface of this. I feel like this is seriously the fly in the wall episode, and I'm having a blast. Tanner, again, thank you so much for being on with us, and we will talk to you guys in part two of this very exciting episode on Christian Science. We got a lot more in store for you guys. Talk to you soon.